Over the years, the Final Fantasy franchise has built itself a solid and respectable reputation, and it's done so by captivating fans all over the world with memorable characters and stories, incredible music and visuals, and awesome gameplay. With such an influential image to uphold, it comes as no surprise that expectations for the franchise's games are usually quite high. And as such, with each progressing title, the developers at Square, and subsequently Square Enix, would place the utmost effort into meeting these ever-increasing standards. But sometimes, achieving these standards has not always been possible. Some fledgling games and ideas would just not live up to expectations, whether it be due to a necessary lack of resource like time and staff, disagreements amongst company units, or just the actual idea being inherently flawed. As a result, these proposed titles would never make it past the initial development stages, and there would be no choice but to cancel the project or repurpose it into something else. Although some of these would be quite high profile, others would remain largely obscured, but amidst the disappointment, some of the ideas would still leave us curious. And as details about these defunct titles would usually be revealed much later on, in more casual settings like developer interviews or social media posts, it begs the question of what these games could have been like, and what they might have contributed to the franchise as a whole. And that's just what we'll be exploring today, as we run down a list of some fascinating games and ideas that were ultimately shelved. So strap yourselves in as we explore 7 Final Fantasy games that unfortunately we'll never get to play. And what better way to kick things off than with Final Fantasy Tactics II. When Final Fantasy Tactics made its debut back in 1997, it would release to great success, earning considerable praise and acclaim for its dramatic storytelling and innovative gameplay mechanics. Helmed by the brilliant minds of Yasumi Matsuno, Hiroyuki Ito, and their wider development team, Tactics deviated significantly from previous Square games in that there was a substantial degree of depth, emotion, and detail embedded within the narrative and the game's world, called Ivalice. This would be particularly awe-inspiring to Hironobu Sakaguchi, who had been wanting to explore the tactical role-playing genre for some time, and he would end up being captivated by the vast, embellished world of Ivalice. With its incredibly rich lore and wide range of content, post-launch, Sakaguchi would then seek to further broaden the horizons of Ivalice, and he would see an opportunity to do so in the form of a sequel, tentatively dubbed Final Fantasy Tactics II. The existence of Tactics II would go unknown for many years, and it wouldn't be until 2018 when Yasumi Matsuno appeared on a celebratory livestream that plans for the ill-fated project were revealed. According to Matsuno, Tactics II would have done away with the original isometric system and would instead introduce a 2D hexagonal grid scheme. In the sequel, jobs would have continued to be an important aspect of the game, but some of the screenshots and bits of info surrounding the title would suggest that showdowns between individual characters would have been given greater focus amongst the grander scheme of events taking place within the game. Even though the project was ambitious, it was unfortunately unable to pan out. From its inception, the game's development was plagued with difficulties. At the time, there was a push for game sequels to release closer together to ride the momentum of the first game's current popularity and success. But the key staff responsible for the success of the original Final Fantasy Tactics, Matsuno, Ito, and their respective development teams, were too busy with other projects like Vagrant Story and Final Fantasy IX. It led to Sakaguchi attempting to take the project on himself with the hope of working with a third-party developer. But he too would end up becoming too busy due to increased involvement with projects like Final Fantasy IX and Final Fantasy The Spirits Within. Later on, Matsuno would also attempt to take charge of Tactics II at Sakaguchi's request, but balancing this hefty task alongside the development of Vagrant Story proved to be too taxing. This, alongside with a multitude of other behind-the-scenes issues, would essentially impede further progress of the game's development, and as a result, the project would ultimately meet an unfortunate demise. But even with the shelving of Tactics II, this didn't spell the end for the sub-series. While Matsuno did share that there wasn't much interest in salvaging Tactics II, the series would still expand with future spin-offs. Games like Tactics Advance and its sequel Tactics A2 would become fan favourites, and War of the Lions, a remaster of the original, would be very well received, to the point that there's still a huge craving for the rumoured updated iteration. As video game development entered into the high-definition era, Square Enix sent numerous delegations of developers to Western studios so that they could learn how they were adapting to the change. On one such trip, a Scandinavian developer called Grin was visited, and having been impressed, they were invited to come over to Japan and pitch their vision for how they would create a game associated with the obscure Lord of Vermilion franchise. After arriving, Grin found that the goalposts were then changed. Instead of Lord of Vermilion, Square Enix wanted to understand how a Western studio would handle creating a AAA game based in the world of Ivalice, something that led to the birth of a project named Fortress. Having been fans of Ivalice themselves, Grin wanted to create a true sequel to Final Fantasy XII, with Barsch serving as the main protagonist. And the narrative will be based around his quest to defeat Lomond, the Sea King, an entity that would rise every 10,000 years who would be seeking revenge against Ash for the actions of her ancestors. Extensive planning was undertaken, with tons of concept art and assets produced. But even with such extensive planning, the game would, unfortunately, never come to fruition, and there were a number of factors that led to this conclusion. According to one of Grin's founders, Ulf Andersson, he was aware that Square Enix were testing the waters, and one of the main complications was around disagreements over the game's art direction. Even though they had asked Grin to propose their vision, Square Enix were unhappy with how much it deviated from what they themselves would have produced. They felt that Grin had gone far too extreme, as they had focused on a Nordic aesthetic that they believed would be necessary to show a whole new side of Ivalice. This feedback led to Grin scrapping their numerous concepts and going back to the drawing board, something that led to some serious crunch, as Square Enix did not want to extend deadlines. The situation then became much more difficult following the purchase of Eidos Interactive. Prior to the purchase, Grin were liaising with Square Enix Japan directly, but after, all communications had to be filtered through Square Enix's new UK office. The only challenge was that they then had their own opinions. This then led to more delays due to nothing more than miscommunication, and with the project not progressing as intended, Square Enix decided to pull the plug, and Fortress would never end up seeing the light of day. To commemorate Final Fantasy XI's long run and loyal player base, Square Enix decided to go big on what at the time was supposed to be the game's last scenario expansion, Rhapsodies of Vana'diel. This gave rise to the Vana'diel project. But as the decision had been taken to sunset the PlayStation 2 and Xbox versions of the game, Square Enix decided it would be smart to focus on the ever-growing mobile gaming scene instead. Thus, alongside the new chapter update, they would announce the Final Fantasy XI mobile project. The mobile project consisted of 2 titles. One of these was Final Fantasy Grandmasters, a Japanese exclusive RPG based around Final Fantasy XI. But it was perhaps the other game that garnered more interest and attention, as it would be a mobile adaptation of the entire game. This ambitious project would be revealed under the provisional title of Final Fantasy XI-R, short for Final Fantasy XI Reboot, and it was interestingly dubbed an MMMRPG, which stood for Massively Multiplayer Mobile RPG. To execute their plans, Square Enix would partner with a Korean gaming company called Nexon, with whom they had already worked with on the Korean server for Final Fantasy XIV. And as the name and project suggested, this was an effort to effectively deliver a complete Final Fantasy XI experience for mobile gamers. To achieve this, gameplay would need to be adapted. This included the incorporation of a touch-based interface, as well as a faster-paced battle system to complement the medium's convenience factor. The development team also sought to seamlessly implement the MMO's original story, as well as creating a graphically enhanced experience for the mobile version via Unreal Engine 4. They also wanted to make solo gameplay more viable while still retaining the community-centric nature of the original game. The initial plan was to launch the game at some point during 2016, however, things didn't go to plan. During the Nexon Developer Conference in April 2016, some screenshots of a redesigned Windurst and Saruta Baruta were revealed to the public, but nothing else was shared. We then spoke to Naoki Yoshida at the end of 2017 to ask what was happening behind the scenes, and he insisted that the game was still in development, something that was verified by Nexon continuing to hire staff for the project. In 2018, it was then revealed that production had been shifted to Nexon 1 Studio. But instead of being a complete replica of the original game, just on mobile, it had now been transformed into an RPG trading card game and renamed to Final Fantasy XI Mobile. More silence then followed until screenshots leaked in early 2020. But later in the year, Nexon revealed that the game had been cancelled, with a difference of opinion between Square Enix and Nexon over the game's vision and direction being cited as the primary reason. Now, during the earlier years of Final Fantasy, in what we might call the Sakaguchi era, there was a cardinal rule that games would remain standalone. Sequels and spin-offs would be allowed, but they would need to exist within supporting mediums such as novels and OVAs. This rule was pretty firm, but it was not necessarily a rule that everyone agreed with, as Yoshinori Kitase was always exploring ways to expand the properties that he was involved with. And in one particular case, this could have seen the development of a Final Fantasy VI spin-off that was focused around city building. This revelation came via a passing comment from Kitase as he was reminiscing about Final Fantasy VI as part of its 25th anniversary. It saw Kitase share that the concept was based around Strago cultivating a village, stating that it would have been similar to SimCity, just on a smaller scale. It sounds rather fascinating, but even though initial planning was done, development was cancelled due to scheduling issues. The idea of a city-building Final Fantasy title would then resurface much later. In the year 2000, Square released a game called Working Chocobo for the WonderSwan, a life simulator where players would raise chocobos and work alongside them to cultivate their land and earn items. Perhaps the Final Fantasy VI city builder would have shared some of the framework of this particular game. However, it is uncertain what the reception would have been like, as Working Chocobo unfortunately only sold around 9,000 copies in its lifetime. The Nintendo DS remakes of Final Fantasy III and IV would garner much praise and positive reception from fans upon release. Co-developed by Matrix Software, these games would make the earlier titles of Final Fantasy much more accessible, but they also afforded Square Enix the chance to go back and refine the gameplay mechanics and presentation to make them more in line with what modern gamers might expect to see. With the success of these respective titles, naturally, expectations were that Square Enix would move on to remaking Final Fantasy V. After all, it was the next game in the sequence. But even though that was the plan, challenges arose. The initial challenge was that Tomoyo Asano and his team, who had been working closely with Matrix Software on the two previous remakes, didn't want to work on a third remake. They instead wanted to work on an original IP, which ultimately became the Four Heroes of Light. As such, Square Enix had to assign the Final Fantasy V remake to another team. But that team would end up encountering numerous technical obstacles, and the Nintendo DS version would end up being shelved and rescoped for the more powerful Nintendo 3DS. Sadly, the Final Fantasy V remake on the Nintendo 3DS didn't ever materialise, as behind closed doors, Square Enix changed the entire focus of the project. This would see them pivot to creating a 2D remake for iOS devices, which upon launch would receive mixed reviews. This meant we didn't ever receive a proper Final Fantasy V remake akin to what was seen with Final Fantasy III and IV, which is a shame, as even Tetsuya Nomura expressed a slight annoyance that those two games were skipped in favour of creating a Final Fantasy VII remake. Chocobos are perhaps the most iconic creatures in the Final Fantasy franchise, appearing in nearly every single title under its umbrella. And as Square looked to explore how they could expand their portfolio of properties associated with Final Fantasy, creating games associated with the adorable mascot made a lot of sense. It saw Square explore numerous ideas for games outside of their traditional genres, and one of the most intriguing experiments in this regard was a fighting game called Chocobo de Battle. The plan was for Chocobo de Battle to be Square's first foray into the arcade scene, with a PlayStation release also being considered. As the name suggested, Chocobo de Battle would have been a fighting game between characters who were literally riding on chocobos. While much of the intended fighting commands and combos were never revealed, some footage was shown that depicted a mechanic where chocobos could fire missiles at one another. In terms of visual presentation, Chocobo de Battle would employ a behind-the-character view rather than the profile view seen in other classic fighting games, and like most other multiplayer games, there would have been a roster of different characters and chocobos, each visually unique from one another. But amongst this rather unusual concept, perhaps one of the most curious aspects of the game were its intended controls. As if it wasn't bizarre enough already, instead of using a standard stick and buttons, gameplay would have been conducted through motion controls. Players would have had to move their hands over a blue motion-sensing board and perform certain gestures in order to maneuver their characters and execute commands. Perhaps because of how ambitious this project was, Chocobo de Battle would end up being cancelled. When speaking with us, Hironobu Sakaguchi shared that the initial objective was to create a game that celebrated the impact of chocobos, but after reaching a certain point in the game's development, they took stock and realised that the concept of chocobos fighting was perhaps not the best way to do that, especially since they didn't even have arms. Even though the game never materialised though, the notion of celebrating chocobos did still manifest through games like Chocobo's Dungeon and Chocobo Racing. And that brings us onto the ill-fated Final Fantasy Versus 13. When the Final Fantasy franchise reached its 13th milestone, Square Enix decided to take a bold new step. It meant they wouldn't just create one game, they would instead create a small suite of games that would exist within a sub-franchise called Fabula Nova Crystallis. The mythos had been created by a group of senior figures within Square Enix, with select individuals from that group assigned as the directors of the 3 proposed games. It would see Motomo Toriyama assigned to direct Final Fantasy XIII, Hajime Tabata assigned to direct Final Fantasy Agato XIII, and finally, Tetsuya Nomura would be assigned to direct Final Fantasy Versus 13. For Versus 13, Nomura wanted to create a game with a darker concept to serve as the antithesis of Final Fantasy XIII, and its universe would be the closest to reality amongst the 3 games. It would also deviate away from the traditional turn-based gameplay, focusing instead on action. But even though the game was announced in 2006, its road to release was plagued with a myriad of issues that by 2011, 5 years after the game had been announced, would ultimately lead to the project being almost halted entirely. It led to some hard decisions being made, as senior figures decided whether Versus 13 should be cancelled or not, especially as a new console generation had now entered into the equation. After nearly 6 years of constant delays and obstacles, in 2012, the project would switch to development for a new console generation, and this would result in its biggest change, as Versus 13 was rebranded to Final Fantasy XV. After its rebranding, the game would experience quite the overhaul. Fresh from completing Final Fantasy Type 0, another Fabula Nova Crystallis project that had also suffered numerous delays, Hajime Tabata was assigned as co-director, with much of his staff joining the development team. Tabata would then take over completely, replacing Nomura as the main director, and he was given the interesting task of not just delivering the game to market within 3 years, but getting gamers excited about a project that was now over 6 years old. This would prove to be challenging, as harsh decisions would need to be made in order to control scope. It would lead to the removal of one of Versus 13's more recognisable characters in Stella, gameplay mechanics were stripped back, and segments of the story were flat out removed and handled within what became known as the Final Fantasy XV universe. It meant that, in the end, what we got would end up being quite different from what we were initially introduced to as Versus 13, and due to Versus 13 existing so long in the wild, this led to disappointment amongst pockets of the fanbase who were quite excited about what this particular project could be. What's interesting, however, is that Versus 13 may be gone, but it hasn't been forgotten. And Tetsuya Nomura has teased numerous concepts relating to Versus 13 within Kingdom Hearts 3. It would see a curious storyline embedded within the game titled Viren Rex. The main character of Viren Rex, Yozora, would bear an eerie resemblance to Noctis, and what's more, there's a scene of Yozora waking up inside a moving car, which is nearly identical to the iconic scene of Noctis waking up in a car in the 2011 Versus 13 trailer. And with that, we're done. They were 7 Final Fantasy games that we will never get to play. Is there a cancelled game that you're quite disappointed was cancelled? Let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to throw us a like. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, Chris M. Walker, The Livestream, Elsa Claire Farron, Galcian Dikujata, Gregory, Justin Dent, Lord of Morning, and Zukan TDK, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.